The Untold Story, a deep dive into hip-hop's most controversial documentary. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most explosive documentaries to emerge from the world of hip-hop, a 4-part series that spans more than 3 decades of music history, celebrity culture, and allegations that have shaken the entertainment industry to its core. This isn't just another recap. We're going to explore the deeper implications, the testimonies, and the questions that continue to haunt one of rap's most influential figures. The filmmakers behind this project have explained that the timing of this release was deliberate. They waited patiently for all legal proceedings to conclude, allowing the criminal trial to run its course before bringing their findings to the public. The documentary itself is structured across 4 comprehensive episodes, each one peeling back another layer of a story that encompasses over 30 years of pop culture, personal relationships, and business dealings. The production team emphasized that assembling this magnitude of material required extensive time, careful research, and meticulous attention to detail. What they've created is arguably one of the most significant examinations of power, influence, and alleged misconduct in modern entertainment history. The importance of this documentary cannot be overstated. While the filmmakers certainly could have relied solely on publicly available information, they pushed beyond those boundaries. They've managed to secure previously unseen footage, obtained exclusive interviews, and uncovered materials that the general public has never had access to before. Among these revelations is particularly striking video evidence that any serious journalist would want to understand the origins of. The question of how this material was acquired becomes part of the story itself, adding another dimension to an already complex narrative. One of the more startling segments features an individual claiming to have taken extraordinary measures to ensure protection from potential retaliation. This person outlines a 3-pronged strategy that allegedly guarantees safety for themselves and their family. The first component involved direct outreach to legal teams representing various alleged victims. According to this individual, the real reason that certain legal consequences continue is due to cases that remain active behind the scenes, away from public scrutiny. This person claims to have provided financial support for legal representation for 7 individuals who had remained silent for years, bringing in what they describe as top-tier criminal defense attorneys from across the country. The second element of this protective strategy involved a calculated business maneuver. This individual states they systematically acquired or blocked every potential post-release business opportunity that had been lined up, planning this intervention approximately 2 years in advance. By the time sentencing occurred, and there remained some hope of eventual release, every business partner had already severed their professional relationships. The third and perhaps most significant aspect involves the collection and preservation of evidence. This person describes an extensive archive of materials that had been concealed for 2 decades, encompassing secrets spanning 30 years, with supporting testimony from alleged victims. The documentary includes interviews with more than a dozen individuals who claim they were manipulated, threatened, or violated. The individual making these claims expresses no fear of associates or threats, asserting that any fantasies of a comeback are unrealistic given the weight of evidence and legal obstacles that have been strategically positioned. The documentary draws heavily from statements attributed to Tupac Shakur, including allegations about jealousy and the infamous Quad Studios incident. Tupac publicly suggested that certain industry figures were involved in the attack, statements that were documented in various interviews during his lifetime. The complexity of these accusations is evident in Tupac's own words, where he indicated having personal knowledge and proof to support his claims, yet expressed reluctance to share certain details publicly, framing them as matters between himself and the accused party. The frustration in his voice was palpable when discussing how initial responses from various parties evolved over time, with witnesses initially claiming to have seen nothing, only to provide detailed accounts several magazine issues later after sufficient time had passed to coordinate their narratives. According to the documentary, Sean Combs, widely known as Diddy or Puff Daddy, is currently serving a 50-month sentence at a federal correctional facility in New Jersey. These charges stemmed from convictions related to unlawful interstate conduct, though it's important to note that a jury dismissed what were described as the most severe allegations brought against him. Nevertheless, public scrutiny has only intensified following late 2023, when his former longtime partner Cassandra Ventura filed a widely publicized civil lawsuit alleging years of mistreatment. That initial filing triggered what became a cascade of additional civil claims, all of which remain unresolved in the court system. Combs has consistently and firmly denied all allegations, maintaining his innocence even as the spotlight surrounding his name refuses to dim. The documentary features extensive commentary from Greg Kading, a former detective who investigated the murders of both Tupac Shakur and Christopher Wallace. Better known as Biggie Smalls or the notorious B.I.G. Kading, is the investigator who conducted that controversial proffer agreement back in 2008 with Dwayne Keith Davis, commonly known as Keith D. During that agreement, Davis allegedly stated that Combs had offered him a substantial sum of money to orchestrate attacks on both Tupac and Suge Knight. The trial involving Davis for his alleged role in Tupac's death is scheduled to proceed in early 2026, and reports indicate that Combs' name has been mentioned more than 200 times throughout the proceedings thus far. One particularly compelling voice in the documentary belongs to someone who reflects on how both Suge Knight and Puff Daddy created an atmosphere that ultimately contributed to the tragic deaths of both Tupac and Biggie. Looking back on the relationship dynamics, this individual notes that if there had been greater trust in certain partnerships, outcomes might have differed significantly. However, the level of trust that was publicly portrayed after these deaths didn't seem to match what was observable during the time when everyone was actively working together in the industry. The documentary ventures far beyond simply rehashing old allegations. It injects fresh claims into the ongoing conversation, reigniting media attention in the process. One of the most remarkable elements is the rare access to private footage that was recorded in a New York hotel just days before Combs' arrest. This material was filmed by a videographer that Combs himself had personally commissioned. The footage shows him in consultation with legal counsel, confronting the mounting pressure from relentless media coverage. It offers viewers an unprecedented behind-the-scenes glimpse into how the constant barrage of headlines was actively influencing and destabilizing his carefully managed public image. The filmmakers reiterate that the timing of the documentary's release was strategic. They deliberately waited to move through all the legal proceedings surrounding the criminal trial. The series spans 4 parts and covers more than 30 years of popular culture intertwined with the subject's personal and professional life. The sheer volume of material and the time required to verify sources, conduct interviews, and assemble everything into a coherent narrative meant that production took considerably longer than a typical documentary project. While the story could certainly have been told using only information already in the public domain, the filmmakers chose to dig deeper. They obtained access to new material that audiences are seeing for the first time, including the aforementioned video footage. Any serious journalist would naturally want to understand the methodology behind acquiring such sensitive material. The footage in question shows Sean Combs during an incredibly tense period, captured in private moments just before his arrest, with cameras rolling as he discusses strategy with his attorney. Legal analysts and industry observers have noted something particularly significant about these recordings. One expert points out that while every celebrity faces various claims throughout their career, and some are completely without merit, certain lawsuits in this case come with what they describe as receipts. There exists footage, voice recordings, and documentary evidence that lends credibility to specific allegations. What makes this especially interesting from a cultural standpoint is how thoroughly artists in the hip-hop community have documented their own lives. Many of these individuals were recording themselves back in 2005, never imagining how accessible and relevant that media would become 2 decades later in 2025, when it could be used to build cases or corroborate testimonies. This extensive self-documentation has become a crucial part of the overall story surrounding Sean Combs. It's relatively rare to witness such open and unguarded conversations taking place before formal charges have been filed. Typically, discussions of this nature are kept strictly confidential, protected by attorney-client privilege and strategic legal considerations. However, the presence of a videographer during these sensitive conversations has led various legal experts to suggest that critical protections may have been unintentionally compromised or weakened. Representatives for Combs later informed NBC News that this recording was never authorized or approved. They stated emphatically that they are unaware of how Netflix managed to acquire this material, emphasizing that the individual who was filming had signed confidentiality agreements specifically designed to keep all content private and strictly restricted from public release. Throughout the documentary, viewers are introduced to several individuals from within Combs' inner circle who provide their perspectives. One such person is Aubrey O'Day, known for her participation in the reality show Making the Band. For the first 3 episodes, many viewers anticipated that O'Day would reveal some major personal incident involving herself and Combs. However, for the majority of that time, she speaks about him in relatively general terms, discussing industry dynamics and power structures. It isn't until the 4th and final episode that O'Day recounts something far more specific and disturbing. According to her testimony, a witness allegedly walked in on a situation where O'Day was in a severely inebriated state while Combs and a second man, described as light-skinned and tall, were engaged in activities with her. The details provided in this section of the documentary are explicit and deeply troubling. This witness maintained that it was definitely O'Day who was involved in the incident. When watching O'Day's own reaction as she discusses this event, there appears to be uncertainty about whether she fully remembers the situation herself. The witness emphasized that it couldn't have been O'Day's choice to become so intoxicated because excessive drinking was never characteristic of her behavior. She had never been known to drink heavily or lose control in that manner. In earlier portions of the documentary series, O'Day reveals a series of emails she received from Combs. These electronic communications were uniformly sexual in nature and tone, with Combs essentially demanding that she come to his location to engage in specific intimate acts. The emails are described as domineering in their language, with Combs clearly establishing and reinforcing his position as the person in power, the boss who expected compliance. O'Day states that these messages made her extremely uncomfortable, yet she felt unable to refuse or push back given the power dynamic. Approximately 6 months after these exchanges, she was terminated from her professional relationship with Bad Boy Entertainment. The series elevates multiple perspectives from individuals who were part of Combs' inner circle, spotlighting former collaborators, artists, and close associates who provide rare insight into his rise to prominence and the extent of his influence. These testimonies from people like Aubrey O'Day deepen the narrative considerably and expose the complex and often troubling realities of operating within the sphere of influence of one of hip-hop's most dominant forces. Another crucial voice in the documentary belongs to Kirk Burroughs, who describes himself as a co-founder of Bad Boy Records. Burroughs claims that at one point he held a 25% ownership stake in the company. His account details how things began to unravel during a critical period when the label was renegotiating its relationship with Arista Records. The company had weathered the storm following the tragic stampede at a charity basketball event at City College of New York, known as the CCNY incident, which had resulted in multiple deaths. With that crisis seemingly behind them, the path appeared clear for Bad Boy to negotiate improved terms and increased financial backing from Arista. Burroughs states he was positioned to benefit significantly from this new deal, given his substantial ownership stake. However, Burroughs describes a confusing and ultimately devastating series of events. He says Combs approached him with a request that made little sense at the time. Combs allegedly wanted Burroughs to temporarily return his 25% stake in the company, with promises that it would be immediately returned once the new deal was finalized. Burroughs describes this as a trick, a manipulation tactic where something is given back only to be taken again under the guise of trust and partnership. He was reluctant to comply, sensing that something wasn't right about the request. Then came a day Burroughs describes as particularly memorable and intimidating. Combs arrived at his office unexpectedly, accompanied by an associate named Kenny Burns. Burroughs states that the visit was clearly planned in advance. Burns allegedly had a briefcase containing all the stock certificates, while Combs brought a baseball bat. Burroughs is careful to clarify that the bat wasn't wielded in an explicitly threatening manner, like he was going to be beaten with it, but its presence sent a clear message. The bat served as a prop in what Burroughs describes as a coercive negotiation, with Combs insisting that this transfer had to happen immediately. Burroughs states that he didn't genuinely fear physical violence in that moment. He mentions having his own people who could respond if things escalated. What truly upset him wasn't the threat of violence, but rather the betrayal of trust. Here was someone he had built a company with from the very beginning, from day zero as he describes it, and now the one solid asset he had been assured was being demanded back at the most critical juncture of their business negotiations. When Combs assured him it was all part of the renegotiation strategy and that he should trust him, Burroughs reluctantly agreed, though he was angry and knew deep down that something wasn't right. He handed over the stock certificates, hoping that trust would be rewarded. Burroughs continued performing his duties, trying to move past the incident and focus on delivering results for the company. He got caught up in the daily work and eventually stopped thinking about the stock situation. Then came what he describes as a snafu, a falling out or disagreement, and suddenly he was fired. Combs simply said goodbye, and that was the end of their professional relationship. Because Combs had never returned the stock as promised, Burroughs found himself with no ownership stake and no compensation. He claims that Combs has avoided him for years, evading any conversation about settling what Burroughs believes he is owed. Not only was he avoided, but Burroughs describes running into resistance at every turn, while the label he helped establish went on to become a global powerhouse. He eventually began working with Mary J. Blige, noting that all three of them, himself, Mary, and Combs, had started out together in the early days of Bad Boy. The documentary includes testimony from LBS, a singer who previously maintained a close relationship with Kim Porter, Combs' former longtime partner who passed away in 2018. LBS reflects on what he personally observed during his time around the couple. Additionally, a former security associate named Roger Bonds alleges that he witnessed aggressive behavior directed toward Cassie Ventura, though he notes that his impression was formed during limited exposure to their relationship. These accounts add further weight to the broader narrative being constructed about power dynamics and alleged misconduct. Burroughs eventually attempted to pursue legal action to recover what he believed he was owed, but his case was dismissed due to statute of limitations issues. Even so, he states that he continues fighting other unresolved claims. His testimony serves as a transition point in the documentary, as it shifts into an examination of the legendary rivalry between Bad Boy Records and Death Row Records, a conflict that came to define an entire era of hip-hop music. The documentary revisits the East Coast versus West Coast divide that fundamentally reshaped the hip-hop landscape during the mid-1990s. Death Row Records rose to dominance with powerful figures like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur representing the West Coast, while Bad Boy Entertainment countered with the Notorious B.I.G., Faith Evans, the Group 112, and the rapper Mace representing the East Coast. However, insiders stress a striking and often overlooked detail. The rivalry that captured headlines and captivated fans wasn't primarily driven by the artists themselves. Instead, it was intensified behind the scenes by label leadership and executive maneuvering. Combs is repeatedly identified as a central force who allegedly escalated tensions until they reached a boiling point. This reinforces long-standing assertions made by industry observers that executive power struggles between Suge Knight of Death Row and Puff Daddy of Bad Boy, not the performers themselves, pushed the feud to its tragic breaking point. The documentary includes disturbing first-hand accounts related to the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas in September 1996. One individual describes being present during the attack, recounting the chaotic scene. They describe seeing a vehicle pull alongside Tupac's car, witnessing someone extend their arm from the back seat, and hearing gunfire erupt. The witness thought initially that the intended target had been killed instantly. They describe the violent exchange, with return fire coming from Tupac's vehicle and bullets striking Suge Knight in the head. The witness recalls ducking down to avoid being hit as rounds continued flying through the air. The documentary draws heavily on Keefe D's 2008 proffer agreement, a controversial legal arrangement where he provided testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution related to certain aspects of his account. During this agreement, Davis allegedly claimed that Combs' associate, a man known as Zip Martin, provided the weapon that was used in the attack on Tupac. According to Davis' testimony to investigator Greg Kading, Zip Martin had a specially designed hidden compartment in his vehicle where he kept this firearm, and he drove that vehicle to Las Vegas on the night of the shooting. The documentary includes confirmation from Kading that Zip Martin did indeed drive the same type of vehicle that Davis described to Las Vegas during that time period. Adding another layer to this allegation, Kirk Burroughs states in the documentary that during this period, Combs had him arranging for multiple people to travel to Las Vegas and securing vehicles for transportation. Burroughs says he is now deeply curious about why Combs wanted so many resources and personnel in Las Vegas at that particular time. In his opinion, based on everything he has learned since, he now believes that Combs was involved in orchestrating what happened to Tupac that night. The documentary argues that the rivalry between the labels rapidly escalated beyond music into something far more dangerous. It portrays a climate where street affiliations and outside influences became deeply entangled with the music industry, placing Combs at the center of a complex web of controversial connections through associates tied to New York's underground criminal scene. Expert commentary and recorded accounts presented throughout the series describe how key figures later came forward claiming responsibility for the tragic 1996 Las Vegas killing of Tupac. This narrative is reinforced through analysis from former law enforcement investigator Greg Kading and first-hand interviews with individuals who were close to the case. The documentary ultimately delivers a tense, insider-driven retelling that frames this era as a volatile collision of fame, power, and unchecked rivalry, rather than a conflict driven solely by artistic competition between rappers themselves. One particularly intriguing section explores rumors about what happened after Tupac's death. There was widespread speculation that Combs had allegedly given Zip Martin a substantial sum of money, reportedly $1 million, which was supposed to be passed along to Keefe D as payment for the attack. However, according to the rumors, Zip Martin kept the money for himself and never delivered it to Davis. The documentary includes an interview with T.K. Kirkland, a comedian who was actually roommates with Zip Martin at one point in their lives, demonstrating how close they were. When asked about this rumor, Kirkland acknowledged that he had heard the same story circulating. The rumor suggests that after Tupac was killed, Combs allegedly gave the money to Zip Martin, who was supposed to hand it over to Keefe D, but Zip never completed that transaction. Kirkland offers an interesting perspective on this, suggesting that if the rumor were true, it might actually have protected Combs from more serious legal consequences. His reasoning is that if the money had been delivered, it would constitute clear evidence of murder for hire, which would likely have resulted in Combs being imprisoned. Because the money allegedly never reached its intended recipient, and Zip Martin has since passed away, there is no direct paper trail or witness to confirm that a payment was made as compensation for a killing. Kirkland is careful not to confirm whether the story is true, but he notes the ironic legal protection that the alleged non-payment may have provided. Keefe Davis went on to claim in various interviews and in his own memoir that Combs had indeed offered financial incentives to outside figures to target both Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight, who was in the driver's seat of the vehicle when Tupac was shot. However, according to Davis, that promised payment was never fulfilled. He cites the fact that Suge Knight survived the attack, and he alleges that the funds disappeared through the intermediary Zip Martin, who has since died. This adds yet another dark and tangled allegation to an already volatile chain of disputed accounts that continue to surround Combs and intensify the controversy explored throughout the documentary. Kirk Burroughs also speaks extensively about the circumstances surrounding the death of the notorious B.I.G. He describes being the person in charge of planning an international media trip to London for Biggie, a promotional junket that was scheduled to take place the weekend after the Soul Train Awards in Los Angeles. Burroughs states that he was supposed to accompany Biggie on this trip the night that Biggie was actually killed. According to Burroughs, Combs made the decision to cancel that London trip at the last minute, and Biggie himself had not wanted to go to Los Angeles in the first place. Burroughs feels strongly that Combs should bear responsibility for what happened to Biggie because the decision to cancel the safer London itinerary and keep Biggie in Los Angeles ultimately led to his death. What Burroughs alleges next is particularly chilling. He claims something that has been rumored for years, but rarely stated so directly by someone so close to the situation. Burroughs states that Biggie was actually in the process of leaving Bad Boy Records shortly before he was killed. According to Burroughs, Biggie had already signed paperwork to extricate himself from his contract with Bad Boy and was planning to move forward with his career independently or with another label. Then Burroughs makes an even more explosive allegation. He claims that after Biggie's death, Combs came to him and instructed him to alter the terms in the contract that Biggie had signed. Burroughs describes Combs as being extremely calculated in this request, allegedly telling Burroughs to simply switch out the middle pages of the contract while leaving the final page intact so that Biggie's original signature would still appear authentic. This alleged forgery would allow Combs to continue collecting royalties and maintaining control over Biggie's music catalog and future earnings, even though Biggie had supposedly signed documents to terminate their business relationship. Burroughs claims that Combs pushed Christopher Wallace, known worldwide as the notorious B.I.G. or Biggie, to travel to Los Angeles to promote his album Life After Death despite clear reluctance and legitimate safety concerns. The trip resulted in Biggie's fatal shooting on March 9, 1997, in the early morning hours after leaving a party in Los Angeles. Burroughs asserts that Combs effectively guided Biggie into a high-risk situation and later misled the public by portraying the trip as Biggie's own choice rather than as a directive from label management. This charge sharply challenges the long-standing version of events that Combs has publicly maintained for more than 2 decades. Burroughs provides detailed context about why the Los Angeles trip was problematic from the start. He explains that it was awards show season, and Bad Boy Records had nominations that required their presence at industry events. As a young, successful, and rapidly growing company, they felt they couldn't afford to be absent from these high-profile gatherings. However, Biggie was dealing with a significant physical challenge. He had recently been in a serious car accident in Brooklyn that resulted in a broken femur. Given his larger physical stature and the leg cast he was wearing, sitting comfortably on a plane, even in first class, was extremely difficult and painful for him. According to Burroughs, Biggie was persuaded to travel to Los Angeles well ahead of the awards ceremony so that he could be there early and avoid the stress of last-minute travel while injured. Burroughs believes Biggie arrived in Los Angeles approximately a week and a half before the Soul Train Awards to allow adequate time for rest and preparation. The plan that had been developed by Arista Records' marketing department was elaborate and unprecedented. Clive Davis, the legendary music executive who ran Arista, believed so strongly in Bad Boy and in Biggie's star power that he organized an international press junket in London. Media outlets from around the world were scheduled to meet with Biggie that Saturday and Sunday following the Friday night awards show. The plan was for Biggie to leave Los Angeles early Saturday morning on an international flight, accompanied by Burroughs, spend 2 or 3 days in London conducting interviews and promotional activities, and then return to New York to finally go home and rest. Burroughs still has the original itinerary to this day, documenting exactly what was supposed to happen. However, late Friday night going into early Saturday morning, Combs called and made an unexpected announcement. He informed Burrows that Biggie was not going to London. He instructed Burrows to contact Arista and cancel the entire junket, and told him that he should go to London by himself to represent the label. Combs stated that Biggie wanted to stay in Los Angeles instead. This decision, according to Burrows, had catastrophic consequences. He explains that there was a budget allocated for everything they did, and the budget for Biggie's presence in Los Angeles for the awards show ended Friday night going into Saturday morning. A completely separate budget was supposed to activate to cover Biggie's expenses and security for the London trip, where he would have been properly protected, surrounded by his friends, and cared for in the style he was accustomed to while handling his press obligations. When that trip was canceled, the London budget was never opened, and the Los Angeles budget had already expired. This meant there was suddenly an urgent need for proper security on Saturday night, but those resources hadn't been arranged because Biggie wasn't supposed to still be in Los Angeles. He was out in public without adequate protection in a city where tensions were still extremely high following Tupac's death just 6 months earlier. As Burrows states plainly, they lost Biggie that night, and the situation that loss created was the worst possible scenario imaginable. They had just lost their most valuable artist, their #1 talent. They were on the West Coast, surrounded by people they knew viewed them as enemies, people who had explicitly warned them not to come to Los Angeles. Yet there they were, and now they had to figure out how to safely extract everyone from the city. Burrows describes having brought most of the company with him to Los Angeles, including numerous interns and young employees. He had to account for their safety with their parents and ensure they all got home that weekend. He indicates that Combs needed to be moved out of the city first, and describes a tense extraction where Combs was placed in the trunk of a vehicle and driven beyond city limits to reach a different airport where he could safely board a flight. Burrows states that he himself remained in Los Angeles until Sunday, making absolutely certain that every intern, every executive, and every young person who had traveled there with Bad Boy was safely back on the East Coast. Only then could they begin making arrangements for Biggie's family to be informed of his exact location and to coordinate bringing his body back home, which took place about a week later. As Burrows describes it, that was the job he had to fulfill in the wake of unimaginable tragedy. Kirk Burrows went even further in his testimony, asserting that the relationship between Combs and Biggie was nothing like the loyal, protective, brotherly bond that has been presented to the public for decades. He claims they were not close at all, and that Biggie's safety was treated with alarming indifference. This portrayal sharply undermines the carefully crafted public image that Combs has promoted since Biggie's death, replacing it with a far more unsettling account characterized by emotional distance, power imbalances, and misplaced priorities where business considerations apparently trumped personal loyalty and basic safety precautions. Adding significant emotional weight to the controversy, Biggie's mother, Voletta Wallace, has publicly stated in interviews over the years that she suspects Combs may have played some role in the circumstances that led to her son's death. This is a deeply personal belief expressed by a grieving mother, and it injects raw emotion into a debate that has persisted for more than a quarter-century. Her perspective intensifies scrutiny over events that have haunted hip-hop history and further complicates Combs' legacy with questions that are as painful as they are unresolved. The documentary includes a powerful moment featuring Gene Deal, who served as Combs' bodyguard during the 1990s and has become an outspoken critic in recent years. Deal describes a phone conversation he had with Voletta Wallace, where she gave him permission to continue speaking publicly about what he knows regarding the circumstances of Biggie's death. Deal expresses his respect for Miss Wallace and states that if she had asked him to stop speaking out, he would have immediately done so out of deference to her. However, she told him to continue doing what he was doing, affirming that she watches his interviews and believes he's doing good work by keeping attention focused on finding truth and accountability. Combs has categorically rejected every single accusation leveled against him throughout this documentary, and in the various legal proceedings he has faced. These consistent denials now stand as his primary defense. The stakes are extraordinarily high, Because if even a single major claim were to be proven true or gain traction, leading to criminal charges, it could completely dismantle the meticulously constructed public image he has spent more than 3 decades building and protecting. The potential reputational fallout and legal consequences would be severe, exposing his legacy to a level of risk that few figures of his stature and influence ever truly face. Greg Kading provides extensive analysis of what happened during the investigation into Biggie's murder. Kading alleges that Combs was not helpful at all in the investigation, and in fact appeared to be actively obstructing efforts to solve the case. The documentary shows various police records and documents where investigators noted that Combs declined to provide additional information at critical junctures. One particularly notable instance occurred at the hospital where Biggie was pronounced dead, where Combs apparently refused to cooperate further with detectives who were desperately trying to gather time-sensitive information. The documentary also displays a document from investigator Russell Poole, who was deeply involved in the Biggie murder investigation for the Los Angeles Police Department. According to the document shown on screen, Poole called Voletta Wallace to update her on the progress of the investigation. She expressed frustration and anger that no one had been arrested for her son's murder. After Poole brought her up to date on the case and explained the investigation team's own frustration with the lack of cooperation from Puff Combs, from Bad Boy Entertainment as a corporate entity, and even from members of Biggie's own entourage who refused to provide further assistance, Miss Wallace reportedly calmed down somewhat and came to understand the difficult situation investigators were facing. Kading states explicitly in the documentary that he believes Combs did not cooperate with the investigation into Biggie's murder, because doing so would have inevitably led investigators back to examining Combs' own alleged role in what happened to Tupac. There's an old saying among detectives who worked these cases that, when you solve one of these murders, you will automatically solve the other. The two cases are inextricably linked, and the documentary suggests that Combs understood this connection and deliberately obstructed justice to protect himself from scrutiny regarding the Tupac situation. As this explosive documentary continues to generate intense discussion and debate, it raises profound questions about accountability, power, and truth in the entertainment industry. Could this documentary spark a new wave of legal challenges for Combs? Will additional witnesses come forward? How will this impact public perception of one of hip-hop's most influential figures? These are questions that the documentary leaves hanging, inviting viewers to form their own conclusions. The filmmakers have succeeded in creating something that goes far beyond a simple recounting of known facts. They've assembled testimony from people who were present at crucial moments, obtained footage that was never meant to see the light of day, and constructed a narrative that challenges decades of carefully managed public relations. Whether you believe all, some, or none of the allegations presented, there's no denying that this documentary represents a significant moment in the ongoing reckoning with how power operates in the music industry. For those who lived through the golden age of hip-hop in the 1990s, this documentary offers a painful re-examination of events that shaped the culture. For younger audiences discovering this history for the first time, it serves as a cautionary tale about unchecked power and the human cost of industry rivalries. Whatever your perspective, this is a story that demands attention and serious consideration. The conversation is far from over. As legal proceedings continue, and as more individuals find the courage to share their experiences, we may finally get closer to understanding the full truth of what happened during one of music's most turbulent and tragic eras. Only time will tell how history will ultimately judge these events and the people involved. That's it for today's deep dive. What do you think about the allegations presented in this documentary? Do you believe the testimony from people like Kirk Burroughs and Greg Kading? How do you think this will impact the legacy of everyone involved? Drop your thoughts, insights, and predictions in the comments below. Make sure to like this video if you found it informative, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into hip-hop history, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.